On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Austin, I welcome you all to another collaborative effort with the Kozmetsky Center of Excellence in Global Finance at St. Edward's University. As well, I'd like to give a special thank you to the director of the Kozmetsky Center, Dr. Cheryl Cross, who is with us here today. And in addition to several members of the community, we have Professor Muhammad's International Marketing Group here as well. Our main topic today, U.S. China Relations, is of particular interest, and we're really pleased to have the speaker with us, who is the president and CEO of the new George Herbert Walker Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. He was the founding executive director of the University of Texas's China Public Policy Center. Prior to that, he had served as senior vice president and Perot Fellow at the New York City-based East-West Institute, where he led the Institute's Track 2 diplomacy work in the areas of U.S.-China relations, East Asian security, and U.S.-Russia relations. He remains one of the longest-serving senior executives in East-West Institute history. Our speaker is also a decorated career U.S. diplomat, specializing primarily in U.S.-China relations. And as a reminder, after our guest speaker's presentation, we'll open up the roundtable for you to directly ask your questions at around 12:35. This program, as I mentioned, will cover a topic of interest. So many of us have personal connections with Chinese citizens or business ties in mainland China in our homes. As a result, many Texans want to know if President Biden's reversal of several of his predecessors' international initiatives while maintaining major policies on China is a glaring oversight or part of a longer-term plan. Some may say that this delay is unnecessarily contributing to China's recent actions, testing the resolve of the new American administration on geopolitical matters like Taiwan or on the South China Sea shipping lanes. In addition, American businesses desperately want to see signs of hope for U.S.-China collaboration. So to help shed some light on these and other issues, the World Affairs Council of Austin is so grateful to welcome back Dr. David J. Firestein and hear his thoughts on the future of U.S.-China relations. Thank you, David.
Ben, thank you so much for the very gracious introduction. I'm really grateful to you and to the World Affairs Council of Austin and to the great St. Edward's University Kozmetsky Center for Excellence in Global Finance, and to Dr. Cheryl Cross and Murtada Muhammad. Thank you all so much for making it possible for me to be a part of this Kozmetsky forum. It's a real honor to do so. And I know we have limited time, and as Ben noted, it's a very rich topic. And so I'd like to dive right into the topic at hand, which is the U.S.-China relationship as we transition from the recently departed Trump administration to the now Biden administration, which has been in office for just under 2 weeks. And I think there's a lot that we can talk about, a lot that we can cover. But what I'd like to do is a couple of things. Number one, just start with a kind of scene-setting assessment of where the relationship is. Number two, talk about what I see as the likely elements of both continuity and change in the U.S. approach to China relative to the Trump administration. And third, to maybe touch briefly on a couple of specific issues and necessarily not dwell at length, but at least to touch on where I think a couple of the changes may manifest themselves. And then finally, just to offer some concluding thoughts. And again, as Ben noted, I very much look forward to leaving a good amount of time in basically the second half of our session for questions and for comments from those who were taking part in this event. So first of all, let me just say a couple of words about where the relationship is. I think it's certainly no surprise to anyone that's followed the news in the last several years that the U.S.-China relationship is now at a modern era low point, a low water mark, I think, across the board. We have certainly seen ups and downs in the U.S.-China relationship over the 42 years subsequent to the normalization of diplomatic relations that occurred in January 1979. under President Carter. And there's been some good times, there's been some tough times, but we have never seen a period in which across the board the U.S. China relationship was as strained or turbulent as it is today, 4 years after President Trump took office. And some of the origins of the difficulties in the relationship today predate the Trump presidency, but certainly over the last 4 years, we have seen a real and very dramatic deterioration in the relationship, the likes of which we really have never seen subsequent to normalization 42 years ago. So that's where things stand. And a number of issues that we can touch on here and talk about in the Q&A session have driven that, issues like COVID-19, the topic of Hong Kong, trade and technology, military and security issues, issues around what's sometimes referred to as Chinese, quote, influence operations, and also human rights, which has become a very pronounced issue once again. And much could be said about all these topics. That being said, let me just make a couple of points about where I see, kind of from a thematic or a conceptual standpoint, before maybe touching on a few of the specific issues, where I think we're going to see some continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and where I think we will see some elements of departure in terms of the new Biden administration. So let me start with the continuity piece. I think there are four things that I would highlight, probably not the only things that could be noted, but kind of four major elements here. Number one is the idea that that was very, very much a part of the Trump mindset, the Trump administration mindset about China. And that is the idea that whatever it was that the United States was doing in years past relative to China, it just wasn't working very well for the United States. So there's a sense that the old way, which enjoyed bipartisan support, Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, Republican and Democratic Congresses, supported the approach that we had for about nearly 40 years. But there was a sense at the outset of the Trump administration that I think will remain with the Biden administration, that whatever it was that we were doing just doesn't work that well or yield optimal results for the United States. And I think that basic mindset is going to represent one area of continuity between the Trump administration and the current Biden administration. The second point that I would note is on the issue of reciprocity. I think there has long been an emerging consensus in the United States that the relationship between the United States and China has not been particularly reciprocal, especially when it comes to the trade and investment relationship. And I think there's no question but that that perception of a lack of symmetry or reciprocity is an accurate perception. In fact, it hasn't been a reciprocal relationship. And the simplest and most obvious way to put that is to simply observe that the US has always been historically far more open to Chinese goods and services entering into our market than China has relative to US goods and services entering into the Chinese market. Yes, there has been a very substantial volume of two-way trade. And yes, US exports to China have grown pretty steadily in recent years. But nevertheless, it is also true that China has just generally not been as open to our goods and services as we have been to theirs. That lack of reciprocity in the trade relationship, but also extending into other areas, has kind of generated a kind of boiling point phenomenon in the American mindset about China. And over some period of years, predating Trump, but also certainly rising to a crescendo during the Trump administration, we now see a consensus in the United States, certainly during the Trump years and extending into the Biden administration, that we need to, from an American vantage point, generate a much greater level of reciprocity in the relationship with China overall. So that is a very important element of commonality or continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. The third element of continuity that I would note is that whereas the Trump administration regarded China as a formidable competitor to the United States, and that's probably putting it mildly, come back to that point in just a moment, it certainly did regard China as being really an existential competitive threat to the United States. I think that notion of China as, quote, existential competitive threat or formidable competitor to the United States will remain part of and a core element of the Biden administration's thinking about China. Now, there's an important nuance here that I'll go into in a minute when I talk about the divergence of the the Biden administration mindset relative to that of the Trump administration. But it is fair to say that both the Trump administration and now the Biden administration see China as a formidable competitor in the case of the Trump administration at a minimum, but certainly in the case of the Biden administration, that competitive framing continues on and that remains a source of continuity as well. Finally, just for purposes here, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, um, but these are some of the key elements that I want to flag. The fourth element of continuity that I see is in the legislative and regulatory framework that we now see governing so much of U.S. interaction with China and U.S. engagement with China. A large number of laws changed during the 4 years of the Trump administration, passed by oftentimes by definitely bipartisan and in some cases unanimous, literally unanimous congressional majorities. Some cases 535-0 in the two chambers, and in many other cases by very, very strong bipartisan majorities. Legislation changed it in a number of different ways, became somewhat more restrictive and tighter around China than it had been, as well as around other countries. But here we're talking about China, and a lot of the impact has been borne by China. And so we saw changes to such legislation as the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is the interagency U.S. government federal entity that reviews incoming foreign investment for potential security concerns, national security concerns. There was legislation called the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRRMA, or FIRMA, that passed that tightened scrutiny around foreign investment. And although it affects everyone, it probably has had a disproportionate effect on Chinese inbound investment into this country. That's one example, and there are others, including the Export Control Reform Act, or ECRA or ECRA, and many other pieces of legislation. By the same token, the President of the United States during the past 4 years, President Trump, issued many different executive orders and presidential level directives that also changed the relationship in a number of very significant ways. The point that I'm making here is that I think most of those laws, probably all of the laws, and most of the executive orders will remain in place for the foreseeable future in the Biden administration. And I think we're going to see a large degree of continuity, not total, but a large degree of continuity around the legislative and regulatory context within which the United States deals with China. So those are some of the elements of continuity that I think, are going to see, and we do see today, and will continue to see for the weeks and months to come in terms of the Biden administration. Now, let me talk a little bit about where I do think we will see some points of departure. And here there are some nuanced but significant distinctions that I think need to be drawn. First of all, and I think most fundamentally, the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, in my judgment, does not view China as the enemy of the United States of America. I think there were a number of significant people in the Trump administration who viewed China as not merely an existential competitor, but as an enemy of our country, and they spoke about China in those terms. In the Biden administration, I think you have a group of people who, by the way, mostly were senior people in the Obama Biden administration that was in place before Trump came into office. And this group of folks, starting with the president and including the vice president, Kamala Harris, and the now Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and others at the top levels of the Biden administration, they view China as a formidable competitor, but not as an enemy. I would cite one particular piece of data that supports this assessment on my part, and that is that when then Secretary of State designate Tony Blinken was testifying in his confirmation hearings just not too many days ago, basically last week or so, a week or so ago, Tony Blinken stated that he regards China as, and I'm paraphrasing here, as a competitor. And to use his words, China is a country that we need to, quote, outcompete. Outcompete was the word that he used. When he spoke about Russia, Iran, and North Korea, however, he used the word threat. And so there was a rhetorical distinction in the same paragraph of his opening statement that I think signals and lends evidence to the assertion that I've made that the incoming administration is not using the same language about China, but that's because they're not fundamentally thinking about China in the way that the Trump administration did. So that's an important distinction. As I often say, um, it may seem like a semantic distinction, but an enemy in the end is a country that you fight a war with, whereas a competitor is a country that you compete with, and there is a big difference between those two. So that's the first point that I would make. The second area of distinction, I think, or point of departure, is whereas the Trump administration approached China through a fundamentally ideological prism, and basically the notion of, quote, America first and, quote, make America great again. And that was the ideological framework through which the Trump administration looked at the world and America, but also specifically looked at China. The Biden administration, in contrast, is not coming at China from an ideological perspective. They're coming at China from the standpoint of how do we actually advance the interests of the United States? Now, it may seem implausible that I can make the distinction that I'm making. In other words, it may seem implausible that we had a president for 4 years that didn't actually worry too much about American interests, but actually worried more about ideology. But let me just give you one data point to substantiate the point that I'm making. And that is that the Trump administration, President Trump personally himself, became an incredible advocate for tariffs, for the use of tariffs to try to, in essence, level the playing field with China, reduce the U.S. Merchandise trade deficit with China, and so on. And the interesting point that I would make is, and I don't have time to dwell on it at too much great length here, but just it's an important data point. Where are we today in terms of the U.S. merchandise deficit with China after 4 years of Trump policies? And yes, you guessed it, we have the highest U.S. merchandise deficit with China that we have ever had in the history of our nation. The highest average annual U.S. merchandise deficit with China of any presidency in the history of America. That is the data. That's the data from the Trump administration. And in fact, to be more specific, and the December numbers are still coming in, and they'll come in actually in a few days. But even without that 48th month of the 4 years, we know approximately what it is. I can tell you the Trump administration's average annual merchandise deficit with China was 10% higher than the next highest president. So here's my point, that it wasn't about the bottom line impact to the United States, because if it were about that, the past administration would not have adopted tariffs, because tariffs hurt our country very badly, as many of you know. It was about ideology. It wasn't about interests. And this is where we're going to see a difference in the way the Biden administration thinks about policy and calibrates policy and makes decisions. The third distinction that I want to make, that I want to observe, that I think will be present in the Biden administration's approach that was not so present in the Trump administration's, is that the Biden administration will place an emphasis on reciprocity, as I mentioned, as a source of continuity, but they will do it in a different way. Whereas the Trump administration basically took the point of view that we will generate reciprocity in all aspects of the relationship, irrespective of whether that reciprocity is actually good for America. Again, ideology trumping interests. The Biden administration is much more likely, in my judgment, to employ what I refer to, and this is my term, but I'm using it to describe what I think is going to be the Biden administration's approach. I think the Biden administration will use what I refer to as smart reciprocity rather than blanket or categorical reciprocity, and will use the notion and the construct of reciprocity where it is in the interest of the United States to do so, but will not necessarily force us to become reciprocal with China where it actually hurts us to do so. And there are any number of different examples that one can cite. But the basic philosophical point that I would make is um, the way that the Trump administration approached China was to say, if China's doing it to us, we're going to do it to them, irrespective of whether that accords with our national values, whether that accords with our political culture, whether it's the way that we run our economy, and so forth. And so, for example, China calls on its companies oftentimes to be patriotic and to serve the nation rather than shareholders. Well, guess what? Trump adopted exactly the same language. And he is on the written record and on the video record many, many times calling for American companies to be patriotic and to respond to the Trump administration's exhortations rather than to shareholder interests. Well, that is a page literally right out of China's playbook. It's not the way we've ever done things under either Republican or Democratic presidents in the past. It is an example of applying a reciprocal style of doing things, even when that reciprocal style is bad for business, bad for America, and contravenes everything that we stand for as a free market economy. So it's one data point among many that one could cite. The last 2 points I'll make before I quickly conclude here, and I want to be cognizant of leaving plenty of time for Q&A, is basically the communication style of the United States has changed. I suspect all of us as American citizens have noted that, and that our president communicates in a way that is very different from his predecessor, and that we're back to a more conventional presidential style of communication rather than a Twitter based, emotional, and frankly juvenile style of communication that we saw over the last 4 years. From a communication and rhetorical standpoint, our nation is now communicating with China and the world and with our fellow Americans differently. And that is going to have, that is a point of departure. And the way, as a related note, the way that we negotiate with China and engage with China in discussions around the key issues of the day will change and has already changed as well. And in my judgment, that will help the United States achieve our objectives more readily because sometimes just the way that one communicates can be so off-putting that it actually gums up the works in terms of substantive outcomes of negotiations. And in my judgment, that's what we saw a lot of over the last several years. I think clearly and indisputably, we will see a different type of communication and negotiating style. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the policies of President Biden, the style will be different. There's no disputing that. And in my personal judgment, I think that'll take us back in a more constructive direction. If I may, I would like to just also add before I briefly conclude here, that I think one of the things, and this is actually a very profound and important point, one of the things that is going to change in the way that the Biden administration approaches the formulation of China policy is that this administration is going to be, already is, and is going to be more fact-based, just objectively, in the way that it thinks about policy. If people think that is some kind of a slight to the Trump administration, and I'm not sure many people would necessarily think that, but let me just cite an example to show you that I'm speaking in a fact-based way. One example of many, many that could be cited is in terms of the Trump administration's fiction-based approach to policymaking, and that's exactly what it was. And it certainly, with respect to the example that I'm citing, the president specifically said hundreds and hundreds of times on the record that China is the country paying for the Trump tariffs. And that, of course, is demonstrably, empirically, factually false, absolutely, categorically, and unequivocally false. It's just not true. And the point being that when you predicate a policy on a demonstrable factual falsehood, such as that, then little wonder that the policy is going to go askew and generate outcomes that you were not expecting. For example, to generate a larger merchandise deficit than we have ever had on an average annual basis with China in our entire nation's history. Well, little wonder when you're fundamentally predicating the policy in something that just isn't true. So there are a lot of examples that I could cite just with respect to China, to say nothing of other topics. And that's an example where a fiction-based approach, literally basing policy in falsehood, had a deleterious impact on our nation. I think the Biden administration is going to take a more fact-based approach when it comes to formulating these policies. Where do I think there will be potentially some changes over in terms of policy outcomes and policy approaches? I think we will over time see a different approach to China with respect to trade and specifically tariffs. Both President Biden and Vice President Harris are on the record making the same point that I've made for a number of years, and that is that tariffs hurt America. They kill jobs. They skew the balance of trade in artificial ways, and they do absolutely nothing to help us with deficits. In fact, they do exactly the opposite, and the list of negative impacts goes on. And Biden and Harris are on the record with those views. Over time, they will reduce or even eliminate the tariffs. They're not doing it right away, but over time, I think we will see a movement in that direction. How fast and how dramatic remains to be seen, but they're on the record saying that that's one of the things that they want to do. And now they're in office, and I think we'll see that. I think we will also see some reversals of some of the Trump administration decisions to cancel things like the Fulbright program, the U.S. Peace Corps presence in China, to restrict Chinese travelers and students in particular coming to the United States. As St. Edward's University well knows, I was stunned, frankly, when I read that from April to September of last year, 2020, there was literally a 99% drop. And I'm not speaking hyperbolically. There was literally a 99% drop in the number of US student visas issued to Chinese students. 99%. It went from 80,000 to 800 during that period. That is data from the Trump administration State Department. That's US government data. Our universities know that that is killing us financially. It's also hurting our economy, and it's cutting us off from important brain power. And it's just a bad policy for the United States. I suspect we'll see a change in those types of policies. And there are a number of other areas where we could see some policy reversals, but those are probably the two that I would highlight as areas where there could be and probably should be some, in my judgment, there should be some change to get the U.S. China relationship moving back in a more constructive direction. Let me conclude. I know my time is about up, and I want to end by about 12:35. Let me conclude with a few final thoughts, and then I'll be truly delighted to take your comments and questions and to hear from you. The Biden administration, Joe Biden's campaign for president had the slogan, "Build Back Better." And I think the United States-China relationship has been torn down on the basis of actions on both sides over the last several years. And I think it should be our goal as a nation today to build back better the US China relationship. It was not perfect in its earlier form. It was functional, but it was not perfect. There was plenty of room for improvement from an American vantage and from a Chinese vantage as well. And I think the United States and China, in my judgment, should, and I hope will, commit to reassessing the relationship and building back better this US China relationship that has been so torn down on the basis of actions on both sides over the last several years. I don't think we are going to go back to a relationship that looked like what it did prior to the year 2017. I don't think there is any going back to the old way of doing things. As I noted earlier, there were problems in the relationship that simmered for many, many years and even decades. And we are now in a different phase of the relationship, but the relationship can be better than it is at this moment in time. I do think, very strongly believe that we need to have greater reciprocity in the US China relationship. I very strongly believe that China needs to, just to put it very simply, and this isn't the totality of the issue, China needs to open its markets to our goods and services to approximately the same degree that America has historically been open to China's goods and services. And that reciprocity needs to apply across a variety of other sectors of engagement as well, not just trade and economics, but in cultural exchanges and a variety of other areas. The fact is, it has been an unlevel playing field. And the only way that this relationship gets to a better place, which I believe it can and will over time, is in part by China acknowledging that there needs to be greater level of reciprocity Meanwhile, the United States needs to act in more constructive ways as well, because we own part of this too. I don't think we're going to see a sea change in the US approach to China in the year 2021. As I've noted, we're not going to see, in my judgment, dramatic change or quick change, but I do think we will see incremental changes and improvements over the course of the next several weeks, months, and over the course of this year and this presidential administration. And I think that's a realistic goal, and one that I believe is shared by the Biden administration, and I think by China as well. And finally, I think both sides bear significant responsibility for the unfortunate and very serious and dramatic deterioration in the U.S. China relationship that we have seen over the last 4 years. Again, that had its roots even in years prior to the Trump administration. Both sides bear responsibility, and both sides have done things that have made the problem worse. That being said, it's also therefore true that both sides have a responsibility to take steps, specific steps and actions to show a real commitment to getting this relationship to a point where it can be functional, where it can be constructive and results oriented, mutually beneficial, and ultimately politically sustainable. And we've got a long way to go to get it there, but I think that that is the right direction. And I think both countries have a responsibility to help move this relationship between the largest and second largest economies in the world in that direction. Last point, and I'll conclude. I think two things are true about the US China relationship at the same time. We have to get our minds around this. Number one, China is the most formidable national competitor that the United States will ever have in the lifetimes of every living, breathing American today. Full stop. There will be no other that will be a national competitor to our nation like China. But it is also, and equally true, that China is an indispensable partner to our nation, and that we need China. China needs us. We can't be the best that we can be as a nation without China, and China can't be all that it was meant to be without America. And whether we like it or not, we need each other, and we have to get this relationship right, because the consequences of getting it wrong are unpleasant and far reaching. When we recognize the essential truth of both of these statements at the same time, as I believe China does, we will calibrate this relationship correctly, and we will get this relationship moving back in the right direction again, and in a way that is good for America, for China, and the world. And with that, I want to thank everyone for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. And building on those comments related to policy, China understands U.S. policy is crafted for short-term objectives. How important is it for U.S. citizens to understand that China plans long-term? And is this, to build on your comments, why you think Biden is continuing some of the disruptive policies from the past administration?
Well, Ben, it's a great question. And let me say a couple of things. One, I totally agree with you that China does think in many ways much more strategically than the United States for a variety of reasons. They do think longer term. I know that's almost a cliche thing to say about China, but it happens to have the virtue of being true. And China is looking at where this relationship is going 50 and 100 years from now. And we're worried about the next tweet. And we're worried about, what's going to be on Hannity, tonight on Fox News. And it is just a different mindset. It is a different way of looking at the relationship, and it's a different set of metrics. And so we need to recognize, quite frankly, that there is a kind of planning horizon and strategic horizon gap in the way that our two countries approach things. And it works against us in a number of ways. But let me make one point about that relates to our foundation's namesake. Again, I work for the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, and George H.W. Bush was a visionary about the U.S. China relationship. He's the only U.S. president who had actually lived in China and really knew Chinese people at a deep level of relationship prior to entering the Oval Office of our nation. And he understood that the U.S., as President Nixon did for his part, in fairness to President Nixon in the 1970s, President George H.W. Bush understood that the U.S. China relationship is about the long game. It's not about where are we today or tomorrow or next quarter. It's about where are we in 100 years. And whether one agreed or disagreed or agrees or disagrees with George H.W. Bush's mindset, and I certainly embrace it fully and think he got it absolutely right. Whether one agrees or disagrees, the fact is George H.W. Bush was thinking about the long-term play. And I think that today we are seeing a short-term, or at least certainly over the last several years, we're seeing a much shorter term thinking, which I think is hurting our country. Ben, to your question about the issue of, when will we see change or why aren't we seeing dramatic change yet? And we're not, although the framing and the language is different, as I mentioned, including in the Senate testimony of Mr. Blinken, now the Secretary of State. And I noted that. But that being said, the policies really haven't changed. Why is that? And I think the answer to that is actually very simple. Very candidly, I think the Biden administration, like any U.S. administration, is very, very concerned about the politics and the optics around China in the context of our immensely charged politics of China in the United States today. And there's just no upside politically, for good or ill. There's a perception on the part of our political leadership of both parties, and now of President Biden and Vice President Harris and their administration. There's just a sense that there is absolutely no upside to appearing to be soft on China, quote unquote. And so there's a huge amount of caution, even when the right thing to do is obvious. And I'll just make one point to make an intellectual point. From the standpoint of you, and I'll stop here and have other questions come in, but one last thing here. From the standpoint of the U.S. interest, if what we care about is the U.S. interest, if what we care about is deficits, if what we care about is jobs, if what we care about is manufacturing, if what we care about is agricultural surplus that under Trump turned into, for the first time in 25 years, an agricultural deficit, if that's what we care about, if those things are what we care about, the right thing for a U.S. president to do would be to unilaterally terminate all tariffs on incoming Chinese goods right now, today. Because by doing that, irrespective of what China does, we actually would be serving our country well and helping our workers, our farmers, our ranchers, our businesses, and our shareholders. Now, will any president ever do that? Absolutely not, because of the notion of, well, you're giving something away for nothing. But if one were to come at this from a purely clinical point of view, there's no question, empirically, mathematically, there's no question that that would be the smart play. By the way, that would generate Chinese reciprocal action on all their tariffs, and that too would help the United States, because they'd get rid of all their tariffs the second that we got rid of all of ours. But even if they didn't, we would still be better off. These are the things that a think tank guy like I can say, because I'm not having to respond to political pressures, but people in political office know that is true. They know that's true, but they can't say it because they don't want to be seen as, quote, soft on China. These are the reasons why the Biden administration is being cautious, even though they know that these policies, certainly with respect to trade and tariffs, are 100% categorical failures from the standpoint of the United States. But over time, I think they will make adjustments, and that's what I certainly hope we'll see.
And going to that and exploring a little bit more this idea of reciprocity for tariffs, Tom Ortman with the Voltabox is asking in the comments here, how do we reach a good level of reciprocity, especially on forced technology transfer or forced joint ventures with Chinese corporations?
Yeah, first of all, those are great questions. And let me just say one thing. In terms of reciprocity, I'd like to see us have reciprocity at the status quo ante level of tariffs. Get rid of the tariffs on both sides. Both nations will benefit from that. But above all, stated from an American perspective, we will benefit from that. And that's unequivocal. And the data shows what it shows. I mean, the numbers don't lie. On the issue of forced technology transfer and joint venture arrangements, China, I think, understands that those practices are very problematic. And they are, right? We all understand that that is part of the unlevel playing field that we've had to deal with for decades with China. And the United States didn't push very hard on it for a variety of, I think, reasonable reasons over the period of the last 2 or 3 decades. But those issues have come into focus now and I think are rightly on the agenda from a U.S. perspective. And I believe China understands it needs to make changes and is willing to make changes in these areas. It has announced some policies that liberalize some of these restrictions, at least in certain sectors, in terms of allowing now for majority foreign ownership, in terms of allowing for moving away from the so-called forced technology transfer. Let's also acknowledge the transfer was not forced, it was voluntary. US companies made the decision to transfer that technology because they thought it was in their best interest to do so. It's true, if they didn't share the technology, they couldn't get into the market, but no one forced them to do it. No one could possibly force them to do it. They made the decision because they believed it was in their best interest. That all being said, it's a problematic approach on China's part. It's not how we do things. It's, in my judgment, not how China should do things. And I hope that China does mean what it says when it says that it is moving away from those practices. And the proof will be in the pudding. We will see over the coming months and over the next year or two, if China is sincere in its stated commitment to make serious and significant changes in these particular policies, which I agree are very problematic. And we'll see how that gets played out. But I think what China now understands is two things. Number one, that there is an unfairness to the way that they've done things, and there is. I mean, there's no question about it. And I think they understand that now in a way they didn't some years ago. Number two, I also think they understand that the current state of affairs in U.S. China relations is just not good for any of us. It's not good for them. It's certainly not good for us. And that we've got to get past this and move to a better place in the relationship. And that China has some work to do on its side to do its part to get us there. And I think that recognition wasn't there 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, but I think it's there now. And we'll find out soon enough. But hopefully we'll see progress on these important issues as we go forward. By the way, let me just say one last sentence. When the United States is trying to get China to buy more of our stuff, it probably makes sense not to offend China with every single sentence that you say. So if the goal is we want you to buy more of our stuff, then why don't we lay off the China virus, quote unquote, stuff, the China plague stuff, and all of these juvenile and outrageous and sometimes borderline or actually racist comments that have been made. You're not going to win friends and influence people and get people to buy your stuff when you're offending them with every single sentence that you utter. It's just not smart relative to our own goals. This is my point. And this is where I think this administration kind of gets that in a way that the previous administration did not.
And the next questions really focus on trade. Donovan Jacinto is asking about trading blocs like ASEAN and the BRICS influencing future relations. And Tom Ortman also had a question about reviving of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And do you see any interest from China in moving us to these types of initiatives?
Well, it's a great question, and I think, as folks know, and as was referenced in the question, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a trade arrangement that the United States had been involved in, as I think people understand, and could have been one of the founding members of, and therefore could have really shaped the agreement some years ago. And President Obama and Republicans in Congress came together. In fact, over the objection of many Democrats in Congress, not all, but many, and actually made it possible for the United States to be a part of those TPP negotiations. And we're on the same side of the issue. Both sides wanted it, both President Obama and the Republicans in Congress. So it was a bipartisan idea. I, like many, and again, I'm a pro business, pro trade, pro globalization person. Just that's where I come down philosophically on these issues. And that's where President George H.W. Bush came down. It used to be where the Republican Party came down, and many Democrats as well. But of course, the Republican Party has abandoned all of this, at least over the last 4 years. But I think it was a mistake to get out of TPP, as the Trump administration did. It certainly was the Trump administration's prerogative to do as it saw fit. It got out of it. And as a result, you now have an incredibly valuable and significant trade pact that doesn't have us in it, but that involves some of the most important countries in the world and the largest economies in the world and so on. I think that was a mistake. Can we get back into it? Theoretically, yes. This administration, the Biden administration, again, Biden having been vice president under President Obama, is philosophically of the view that TPP would be good for the United States. That said, years have passed, and the document and the agreement ended up in a place that was negotiated by others, not us, because we weren't at the table. And so we have to see what we can do to make it work. And is there a way to be a part of it and accept the tenets of it, et cetera, having not shaped it? But that's an open question, and I hope that we move back more in that direction. Another major trade pact was signed just about 2 months ago, also in the Asia Pacific region. This RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a comparable trade pact, again involving major players, including ASEAN players, as you noted in the question, Ben. All of these are things we could have been involved in, but weren't, because the Trump administration simply didn't believe in multilateral engagement on trade issues. We now have an administration that I think buys into that more. And I think it would be good for our nation to get back into the negotiating room so that we can shape outcomes rather than merely respond passively to things that other nations are doing. I think that's in our interest.
Thank you very much. And the next question comes from Tyler Johnson, who worked on Dell and lived in China, setting up the Dell operations there. What specifically might students, community leaders, and businesses do today to prepare for enhanced competition with China?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say Tyler is a good friend, and I have a lot of respect for what he's done professionally, and I appreciate the question. So, the point that I would make in broad terms is pretty simple. The one thing that we as a nation can control is us. We can't control China, however much some folks may wish to do so, or however desirable that may seem to be from the standpoint of many Americans in Washington or elsewhere. The fact is, our ability to control what China does is zero, none. We may have some marginal ability to shape outcomes here or there, but China is going to do what it is going to do. We can react to it. We in the United States can, quote, punish China for the sins that we perceive that China has committed, just as they can punish us for the sins that they believe we've committed. But the only thing we actually can control is us. And so I think what we fundamentally have to work on as a nation is getting our own house in order and upping our own ability to compete and to innovate and to do a better job protecting our own intellectual property. It's wrong for China and for folks from China, whether individuals, entities, or anyone else that's involved in theft of intellectual property. It's wrong to take intellectual property without permission, to steal intellectual property. It's also really problematic that we're not doing a better job protecting our intellectual property. And that's the other side of the equation. So I think what we need to do is focus on enhancing our capabilities, our national capabilities, our research and development, our governance, quite frankly. um, our ability to plan and think about the future. Look, just as a data point, China is investing 100 times more from reports that I've seen, 100 times more in quantum physics than we are as a nation. Is that China's fault? Are they wrong to do that? Should we blame China because they're putting in 100 times what we put into this critically important sector of the 22nd century economy? Well, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, why don't we do a better job ourselves in investing in the future? So I think that where we're going to have the most success, to Tyler's very good question, is to say, look, um, here's what we can control. Let's focus on what we can control. And yes, to the extent that we can, let's disincentivize China from doing things that we regard as being problematic. And yes, China does a lot of things that are very problematic for our country, no question about that. By the way, from their vantage, we do a lot of things that are very problematic for them. But we can try to disincentivize that. But what the conversation we really need to have in this country is about us and about making ourselves more competitive. I hope that our nation competes with China, outcompetes China, and beats China in a fair contest, and that we continue to have primacy and supremacy and technology and so forth. That's what I hope. But we're going to get there by focusing on us, uh, not focusing on China and not complaining about the referees. I mean, we got to where we have gotten to as a nation by doing it, by doing what we do, by competing, by winning, by innovating. And now, the last 4 years at least, all we seem to do is complain to the refs instead of take care of business on the playing field. When we get back to that, that's when we're going to see the kind of results that we expect from our great nation.
And related to this competition, Hector Quintanar has a question about China investing in Mexico and the Asian migration of manufacturing into Mexico to utilize U.S. existing trade agreements like USMCA to compete with us when we were using tariffs to compete with China's manufacturing. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, let me say a little bit about that, but let me pick up on the last point first, and that is, one data point. And I've been very prolific on the record for 3 years on the inefficacy of the Trump administration's chosen approach to the issue of the trade relationship with China. And let me just say, I think the Trump administration, like previous administrations, broadly correctly diagnosed the problem. Problem is they prescribed the wrong medication, or to put it a different way, they came up with a solution to the problem. The problem was that the solution ended up being worse than the problem. That's what happened. But the diagnosis was not incorrect. But here's the thing: the results ended up being horrible. With respect to manufacturing, Ben, which you just mentioned in the question, we've lost over 200,000 manufacturing jobs from January 20th, 2017 to January 20th, 2021. That's the data. That's the numbers. We lost manufacturing jobs under this approach. And by the way, in case someone says, well, that's because of COVID, the data shows that even before COVID, we had lost over 200,000 jobs, or approximately 200,000 jobs, even before COVID took the devastating toll on our economy that it did. The fact is, these policies have cost Americans manufacturing jobs, not created manufacturing jobs. And so this is just another data point. To the point about Mexico, I think there are clearly some opportunities. There's been a perception, certainly in China and other trading partners, that there are opportunities to kind of go into Mexico to become a player within the North American continent and within the context of the new NAFTA or the USMCA, the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement, as it's now called, and to kind of come, if you will, within the tent and produce within North America and get around some of the tariff thresholds and tariff barriers. There are elements of the USMCA agreement that seek to disincentivize that. And so there's a technical set of issues that companies have to work through. But it is true that a lot of companies in Asia and elsewhere are asking themselves the question, now that you've got USMCA, which I supported and it was for, and it's certainly broadly comparable to NAFTA, and with perhaps with some tweaks and with some improvements. But bottom line is, it was a good idea when it was NAFTA. In my judgment, it's a good idea in the guise of USMCA. And a lot of people think about, how do we come in and operate as a North American entity? And I think we're going to see more of that, unless and until the United States changes its approach with respect to tariffs and gets back to a pro-trade, open trade regime. And the other point I would just want to make again on tariffs, not to beat the dead horse, but to make another important point. The Trump administration seemed to have difficulty understanding the potential second and third and fourth order effects of policies. And it seems as if the administration thought, well, if we put tariffs on China's incoming goods and services, then there will be fewer Chinese incoming goods and services, and therefore will reduce the deficit. As I mentioned, exactly the opposite happened. But the reason is, the administration didn't seem to take into account the very basic notion that China would immediately adopt reciprocal tariffs, which largely negated and neutralized the impact of the ones that we put on them. And by the way, when you put the tariffs, you end up shifting production to other countries, but not necessarily here, which is, again, why we lost manufacturing jobs net. So anyway, there's a lot here. And the phenomenon that you described in the question is one that people are looking at and trying to operationalize. But all of that could change if we get back to the traditional pro-trade, open trade posture of the United States that has existed under both Republican and Democratic presidents prior to President Trump.
Thank you. And, before we close today, I want to recognize our partner and the esteemed director of the Kozmetsky Center, Dr. Cheryl Cross, to offer her thoughts on today's program. Dr. Cross, if you'd like to take the microphone.
Well, David, thank you very much for that informative and insightful briefing today and presentation. I thought that you gave us a lot to think about. It's certainly a challenging topic, and I couldn't agree with you more when you suggest that China is both the most formidable competitor that we face and also so important to the United States. So getting this right is critical for the security, I would argue, of the United States and the entire international community. And I'm just glad that there are colleagues like you working on this topic. And I know the Austin business community, people here like Tyler Johnson and others who have had extensive experience working in China. And I think that could be very valuable for the administration going forward in terms of thinking how we could move this relationship on a more productive track, which will be so important for all of us. And I also want to say that I really appreciate the strong turnout that we have here today. This is a tremendous opportunity for St. Edward's University students to hear from experts and practitioners who have been working with China, to think about ways that they can prepare in terms of their educational experience, internships, to be here to ask questions. So the only regret I have is that I think we could go on a lot longer today because there's still so much more to talk about. But thank you for the excellent session, and thank you for all of those who joined us today. And we'll look forward to the next session with the World Affairs Council on global business, policy, political risk. Thank you very much.
David and Dr. Cross, I thank you both for today's program. I urge all of our attendees to keep an eye on the World Affairs Council's calendar of events for future Kozmetsky Center forums, as well as our monthly United Kingdom Fireside Chat series. The next one will feature the Consul General of Great Britain and a representative from WP Engine on Tuesday, February 16th. Also, the next monthly World Affairs Council's Globalist Coffee House discussion will be held on the evening of February 18th. So we hope to see you then. Enjoy the rest of your day.